It began quietly, not with screams, not with alarms, not with anything that would draw attention. It began in the kind of silence most people never question. Late summer nights in Mattoon, Illinois, were usually calm. The air was warm. Windows were left open. The town slept early and deeply. In 1944, Mattoon was not a place where strange things happened. It was a working town, a modest town, one of thousands scattered across the American Midwest. People knew their neighbors. Children rode bicycles in the afternoon. Men returned home from factories and rail yards just before sunset. At night, the streets emptied. By midnight, only porch lights and street lamps remained. That was when something changed. The first reports all shared the same pattern. It was always late, always quiet, and always sudden. A smell would appear without warning. Not smoke, not fire, something unfamiliar. Sweet, some said. Metallic, others claimed. Almost like chemicals, it did not linger long, but its effects came quickly. A tightening in the chest, a weakness in the limbs, a heaviness that made it difficult to move or speak. People described the same sensation again and again. They were awake, they were conscious, but their bodies no longer responded. In the dark, some tried to call out. Their voices failed. Others tried to stand. Their legs would not support them. And then, as suddenly as it came, the smell was gone, leaving behind confusion, fear, and the certainty that something had entered their homes. At first, these stories were shared quietly, between husbands and wives, between neighbors over fences, between friends who trusted one another enough to speak without being laughed at. But fear does not remain small for long. In a town already strained by war news and rationing, anxiety had no trouble spreading. America in 1944 was not calm. The war was nearing its final stages, but no one knew that yet. Every radio broadcast carried the weight of uncertainty. Every newspaper headline reminded people that danger could arrive without warning. The idea of an invisible threat was already familiar. Enemy submarines off the coast, saboteurs, poison supplies. Even in places far from the front lines, the war had entered people's minds. So when something unseen began affecting people inside their own homes, the fear found fertile ground. The first widely documented incident occurred near the end of August. A woman woke suddenly in the middle of the night. The room felt wrong. The air was heavy. She noticed the smell almost immediately. Within seconds, her muscles weakened. Her arms felt numb. Her legs would not move. She tried to sit up and could not. Panic followed. Her breathing became shallow. Her heart raced. She attempted to call for help, but her voice barely carried. When her husband woke and turned on the light, the smell had already faded. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken glass, no disturbance. The windows were exactly as they had been before. Doctors examined her later that night. They found nothing conclusive. No burns, no visible injury, no obvious poison. She recovered fully within hours. The incident might have ended there. An isolated event, a strange but forgettable night. But it didn't. Within days, another family reported the same thing. Then another, different houses, different streets, the same smell, the same paralysis, the same confusion. Some victims claimed they heard a faint hissing sound just before the smell appeared. Others described a sensation like pressure in the room, as if the air itself had changed. A few reported seeing a shadow outside their window, tall, still, gone when they looked again. Police officers were called. They searched the area. They found nothing. No footprints, no equipment, no suspects. At first, authorities were reluctant to make statements. They did not want to inflame public fear. But the reports kept coming. By early September, the number of incidents had grown too large to ignore. Local newspapers began publishing brief articles, carefully worded, non-committal. They described unusual complaints and mysterious odors, but readers understood the implication. Something was happening, and no one could explain it. As coverage increased, so did the intensity of the reports. Victims described similar symptoms with remarkable consistency: a sweet or chemical smell, a sudden loss of muscle control, nausea, dizziness. In some cases, a lingering weakness that lasted for hours. Doctors remained divided. Some believed the symptoms were physical. Others suspected anxiety-induced reactions, but none could provide a definitive explanation. The police department began receiving calls late into the night. Residents asked for patrols. They asked for protection. They asked for answers. Officers walked the streets after dark, flashlights scanning yards and windows. They listened. They waited. Nothing appeared. The absence of evidence only made the fear worse. People began altering their routines. Windows were sealed shut. Lights were left on overnight. Families slept in the same room for safety. Neighbors took turns staying awake. The night, once a time of rest, became something to endure. And then, someone gave the fear a name. It appeared first in conversation, then in print. The Mad Gasser of Mattoon. The phrase was dramatic, unsettling. Once spoken, it transformed vague anxiety into something concrete. An attacker, a presence, a figure that could be blamed. The name spread quickly, and with it, the fear grew sharper, more focused. People were no longer afraid of an unexplained sensation. They were afraid of someone moving silently through the town, someone who could not be seen, someone who left no trace. Police attempted to reassure the public. They issued statements urging calm. They suggested that the symptoms might be exaggerated, stress-related, psychosomatic, but reassurance was difficult when victims continued to come forward. These were ordinary people, neighbors, friends, people with no reason to lie, and they all described the same thing. Something entered their homes at night, something they could smell, something that took control away. By mid-September, Mattoon was no longer sleeping. The town was listening, waiting, watching. Every noise was suspect. Every unfamiliar smell raised alarms. Fear moved faster than any attacker ever could. And whether the Mad Gasser was real or not, the effect was undeniable. An invisible presence had taken hold of the town. Not through force, but through uncertainty. And once fear reached that point, it no longer needed proof to survive. It only needed another night, another open window, another unanswered question. To understand why fear took hold so quickly in Mattoon, it is necessary to understand the moment in which these events occurred. 1944 was not a normal year. America had been at war for nearly 3 years. Nearly every family had someone overseas or preparing to go. Radios were always on. Newspapers were read closely. People listened for names, for locations, for numbers. The war was not distant. It was present in every conversation, every ration line, every factory shift. Mattoon was no exception. The town relied heavily on industry and rail transport. Factories ran long hours. Many workers were exhausted. Sleep was already shallow. Nerves were already strained. At night, when the streets emptied, the mind had room to wander. And in times like these, uncertainty became dangerous. The government warned citizens to remain vigilant. Posters encouraged people to report suspicious activity. The idea that enemies could operate inside the country was not dismissed as paranoia. It was policy. Across the United States, rumors circulated. Strange lights, unfamiliar accents, mysterious devices. Most were never substantiated, but they left an impression. The idea that danger might be invisible, or disguised, or silent, was already part of the national consciousness. So when residents of Mattoon began describing an unseen attacker, the story did not sound impossible. It sounded plausible, and plausibility is all fear needs to grow. Mattoon itself was not large. Roughly 12,000 people, small enough that news traveled fast, large enough that strangers could pass through unnoticed. The town was divided into quiet residential blocks, each with houses close enough to hear a neighbor's door open at night. Most homes were modest, wooden frames, porches facing the street, windows designed to let air move freely during the summer. Those open windows would later become central to the story. The geography of the town also mattered. Railroad tracks ran through the area. Factories used chemicals for cleaning and processing. Industrial odors were not unusual during the day, but at night, when everything was still, unfamiliar smells were noticed immediately. This detail would later be used to dismiss the reports. Authorities suggested that residents might have mistaken ordinary industrial fumes for something more sinister. But this explanation did not convince those affected. The smells were not consistent. They appeared suddenly. They vanished just as quickly. And most importantly, they were accompanied by physical symptoms that could not be ignored. As the reports increased, the town entered a state of hyper-awareness. People paid attention to sensations they would normally dismiss. A tight chest, a headache, a strange taste in the mouth. In another context, these might have passed unnoticed. But in Mattoon, in 1944, they became potential evidence. Police logs from the period show a sharp increase in calls after midnight. Officers were dispatched repeatedly to quiet neighborhoods. They searched yards. They checked doors. They spoke with frightened residents who struggled to describe what had happened. Often, by the time officers arrived, there was nothing to investigate. No odor, no suspect, only a shaken household and a lingering sense of violation. This pattern frustrated both police and the public. Law enforcement could not act without evidence. Residents could not relax without reassurance. The gap between experience and explanation widened, and into that gap flowed speculation. Some believed the attacker was using a chemical agent. Others thought the gas was harmless, but the fear it caused was not. Rumors spread quickly. Someone claimed to have seen a man carrying a spray device. Another said they heard footsteps running away. Someone else described a figure disappearing behind a fence. Each story added detail. Each retelling made the threat more concrete. Even when accounts conflicted, the underlying belief remained the same. Something was happening, and it was happening at night. As September progressed, newspapers began printing more extensive coverage. The tone shifted. Articles no longer treated the events as isolated complaints. They began referring to a pattern. They listed addresses. They described symptoms. They quoted victims. With every printed word, the story gained weight. The name Mad Gasser appeared more frequently. It gave readers something to imagine, a figure, a villain, something external, something to blame. This was psychologically significant. An unknown sensation is frightening. An unknown attacker is worse. The idea of a person moving through the town with intent changed how residents perceived their environment. A dark yard was no longer empty. A shadow was no longer harmless. Every unfamiliar sound became suspicious. And once that mindset took hold, it was difficult to reverse. Doctors were drawn into the situation. They examined patients carefully. Some reported mild inflammation of the throat. Others noted no physical signs at all. No consistent medical explanation emerged. Some physicians privately believed the symptoms were stress-related. Others remained uncertain. Without chemical samples, there was nothing to test. Without a suspect, there was no way to investigate further. Public officials attempted to restore calm. They reminded citizens that no concrete evidence of an attacker had been found. They urged people not to panic. But panic does not respond to reason alone. It responds to reassurance. And reassurance requires answers. Answers no one could provide. Behind closed doors, debates intensified. Was Mattoon experiencing a real chemical assault? Or was it witnessing a psychological phenomenon unfolding in real time? The concept of mass hysteria was not new. It had been documented in schools, factories, and communities under stress. But applying that explanation here felt dismissive to many. The victims did not feel hysterical. They felt violated. They felt physically affected. And their experiences were too similar to ignore. Still, without evidence, authorities had few options. Patrols increased. Officers stayed alert. But the town remained vulnerable to something that left no trace. By mid-September, daily life had changed. Children were kept indoors after dark. People walked in groups. Windows were locked. Nighttime became a period of vigilance rather than rest. Sleep deprivation spread, and with it, irritability, anxiety, heightened sensitivity. The conditions that allow fear to sustain itself were firmly in place. What made the situation particularly unsettling was the lack of escalation. No one was seriously injured. No one died. The incidents were frightening, but not lethal. This ambiguity kept the story alive. If the attacker had vanished quickly, fear might have subsided. If the attacks had grown more severe, decisive action might have followed. Instead, the events existed in the space between, enough to disturb, not enough to resolve. That uncertainty became the defining feature of the case. People waited each night, unsure whether they would be next. And when nothing happened, the tension did not ease. It simply carried over to the next evening. The town existed in a suspended state, caught between belief and doubt, experience and explanation. By the time September was drawing to a close, Mattoon had become a place transformed, not by visible destruction, not by violence, but by an invisible presence that may or may not have existed. And that was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. Whether the Mad Gasser was real or imagined, the effect was undeniable. Fear had altered behavior. Silence had become suspicious, and the night no longer belonged to sleep. As September continued, the reports no longer felt isolated. They began to overlap. One incident followed another, so closely that residents stopped asking whether something was happening. They began asking when it would happen again. Late one evening, just after midnight, a young couple reported waking up at the same moment. They had left their bedroom window open, as they always did during warm nights. The smell came first, sharp, unfamiliar, not strong, but impossible to ignore. Within seconds, the woman felt her arms grow heavy. She tried to reach for her husband, and found she could barely move. Her fingers would not respond. Her legs felt numb. The man reported a sudden dizziness, a pressure in his chest. He managed to sit up, but felt as if the room were spinning. By the time he reached the light switch, the smell was gone. Police arrived within minutes. They searched the yard, they checked the windows, they found nothing. The couple recovered fully by morning. The following night, another report came from a different part of town. This time, it was a teenage girl. She had been reading in bed. The house was quiet. Her parents were asleep in another room. She later described smelling something sweet but wrong. Almost immediately, her legs began to shake. She tried to stand. She collapsed. Her parents were awakened by the sound of her falling. They described her as pale, disoriented, unable to speak clearly. Doctors examined her later that night. They could not identify a cause. No fever, no injury, no chemical burns. The symptoms faded within hours. Then there were nights with multiple reports. 2 houses, 3, sometimes on opposite sides of town, sometimes only blocks apart. Always late, always sudden, always gone before help arrived. Police officers began keeping informal notes. Patterns emerged. Most incidents occurred between midnight and 2 in the morning. Most involved bedrooms. Most involved open windows or doors. But even these patterns were inconsistent. Some victims reported sealed windows. Others claimed they had smelled the gas in rooms far from any opening. The lack of consistency made investigation nearly impossible. One officer later recalled that the most disturbing part was not what they saw, but what they never saw. No suspects fleeing the scene, no equipment left behind, no trace of gas in the air. It was as if the events erased themselves. As fear intensified, residents began to take matters into their own hands. Men stood watch outside their homes. Some carried flashlights. Others carried improvised weapons. Neighborhood groups formed quickly. They shared information, they compared notes. They tried to predict where the next incident might occur. But the pattern refused to reveal itself. One night would pass without incident. The next would bring multiple calls. This unpredictability made it impossible to relax. Sleep deprivation spread through the town. People lay awake, listening. Every sound became amplified. The creak of a house settling, a distant train whistle, a passing car. Each noise raised heart rates. Each unfamiliar smell triggered panic. In several cases, residents reported symptoms even when no gas was later suspected. A tight chest, a sudden weakness, a wave of nausea. Doctors began to suspect that fear itself was contributing to the physical reactions. But again, this explanation did not satisfy those affected. Because the fear did not feel imagined. It felt triggered, it felt external. And that distinction mattered. Police increased patrols. They focused on areas where reports had clustered. They questioned residents. They questioned factory workers. They questioned anyone who seemed out of place. No arrests were made, no suspects held. The town existed in a constant state of alert. And then came one of the most widely discussed incidents. A woman reported smelling gas shortly after midnight. She felt her body weaken almost immediately. Unlike previous cases, her husband claimed he heard a faint hissing sound near the window. When police arrived, they found no device, no damage, but the detail of the sound captured public attention. It suggested intent, a mechanism, something controlled. Newspapers seized on this detail. The story spread beyond Mattoon. Other towns began to watch with interest, some with concern, some with skepticism. Officials worried about copycat behavior, or worse, the spread of fear to neighboring communities. They emphasized the lack of evidence. They urged restraint. But by now, the Mad Gasser had become part of Mattoon's identity. Children whispered about him. Adults discussed theories late into the night. Every unexplained sensation became suspect. At the same time, cracks began to appear in the narrative. Some reports contradicted others. Some symptoms differed. Some victims experienced intense paralysis. Others reported only mild discomfort. The time between incidents varied widely. Skeptics pointed to these inconsistencies as proof that no attacker existed. Supporters of the theory argued that variations were to be expected. After all, no two exposures would be identical. This debate played out quietly in living rooms and openly in the press. Police grew increasingly frustrated. Without evidence, they could not act decisively. Without action, fear continued. One officer later stated that the town was chasing something that behaved like a ghost. Present one moment, gone the next, never leaving tracks. By late September, reports began to slow. Not stop, just slow. A few nights passed without calls, then one, then another. Residents waited for the pattern to return. It did not. The silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the attacks themselves. People did not immediately relax. They remained cautious. Windows stayed closed. Lights stayed on. Only after weeks without new incidents did routines begin to normalize. Even then, the memory lingered. The events had changed how people understood their town. The idea that danger could appear without warning, without explanation, and without resolution had taken root. And once planted, it did not disappear easily. Whether the Mad Gasser was real or not, the effect was permanent. Mattoon had experienced something that defied simple explanation. Something that lived in the space between physical reality and psychological response. And as the reports faded into history, the questions they raised did not. They simply waited for someone to ask them again. As the reports slowed, attention shifted from the streets to the institutions meant to provide answers. Police departments do not like mysteries without evidence. They cannot file reports against rumors. They cannot arrest fear. In Mattoon, officers found themselves responding to something that behaved unlike any crime they had encountered before. There was no crime scene, no weapon, no suspect. Each call ended the same way: a frightened household, a story difficult to verify, and nothing to collect. As days passed without new incidents, pressure mounted to explain what had happened. Not to stop it, but to define it. Police officials began speaking more openly to the press. Their language changed. Early statements had emphasized caution. Later statements emphasized probability. They began suggesting alternative explanations. Stress, exhaustion, psychological response. The term mass hysteria entered the conversation quietly at first, then more openly. This shift was not accidental. Officials understood that uncertainty could sustain fear longer than denial. If the events were framed as psychological, then the threat became internal rather than external. That framing mattered. Newspapers followed the lead. Headlines softened. Reports focused less on new incidents and more on expert opinions. Doctors were quoted. Psychologists were consulted. Articles explained how anxiety could manifest physically, how fear could cause paralysis, nausea, dizziness, how suggestion could spread symptoms through a community already under stress. For some readers, This explanation made sense. For others, it felt like an insult. Victims did not feel hysterical. They felt attacked. They felt something had entered their homes without permission. The idea that it was all in their heads did not sit easily. Still, the absence of evidence forced the narrative in one direction. No chemical traces had ever been found. No devices were recovered. No suspect was ever identified. Without these elements, the case could not remain a criminal investigation. It became something else, a social phenomenon. Behind the scenes, officials debated their approach. They worried about the consequences of validating fear. If they acknowledged an attacker without proof, panic could escalate. Copycat reports might spread. Other towns could experience similar outbreaks. The safest option, they believed, was to normalize the events, to reduce their power by reframing them. Public reassurance became the priority. Police patrols gradually returned to normal levels. Statements emphasized calm. The message was clear. The danger had passed. Even if no one could say exactly why, the press moved on. New stories replaced old ones. War updates reclaimed the front pages. Mattoon faded from national attention. But inside the town, the experience lingered. People remembered which nights they had stayed awake, which smells had frightened them, which rooms had felt unsafe. Some residents accepted the official explanation. Others never did. Years later, when interviewed, former victims described frustration. They felt their experiences had been dismissed, explained away, categorized as something less real. This divide would persist for decades. Researchers who later examined the case found it difficult to separate fact from interpretation. Police records were incomplete. Medical reports were inconclusive. Newspaper articles varied in tone and accuracy. What remained were testimonies, and testimonies are complicated. Memory changes. Fear reshapes recollection. Details blur. But patterns remain. One of the most striking aspects of the Mad Gasser case is how quickly the narrative shifted. From unknown attacker to psychological episode, without any definitive turning point. There was no arrest, no discovery, no revelation. The story simply lost momentum. That loss itself became part of the mystery. Why did it stop? If an attacker existed, why disappear without explanation? If fear alone was responsible, why did the symptoms cluster so closely in time? Why did they not continue indefinitely? These questions troubled later analysts. Some argued that once authorities publicly reframed the events, fear lost its fuel. The narrative changed. The threat diminished. People slept again. Others suggested that if there was a real source, it simply moved on, or stopped. Without evidence, these theories remain speculative. What can be said with certainty? The town had learned that explanations do not always arrive when events end. Sometimes they never arrive at all. And when that happens, stories fill the gap. Stories repeated, stories debated, stories passed down. Each retelling slightly different. Each interpretation shaped by the teller. This is how mysteries survive, not because they are dramatic, but because they are unresolved. The Mad Gasser of Mattoon did not leave behind a legacy of violence. It left behind a legacy of doubt, and doubt has a way of lasting longer than fear. With no arrest and no physical evidence, the story of the Mad Gasser of Mattoon became a question of interpretation. What exactly had the people of Mattoon experienced? Over time, several major theories emerged. Each attempted to explain the same set of facts, and each left important questions unanswered. The first theory was the most straightforward, that the attacks were real, that some form of chemical agent had been released into homes at night. Supporters of this idea pointed to the symptoms: paralysis, shortness of breath, nausea, lingering weakness. These were not vague sensations. They were physical, and in some cases, severe. Mattoon was surrounded by industry. Factories used solvents. Rail lines transported chemicals. It was not unreasonable to imagine that someone with access to industrial substances might misuse them. Perhaps an employee, perhaps someone with technical knowledge. The idea of a lone individual experimenting with chemicals fit the image many residents had already formed. an unseen figure, operating at night, leaving no trace. But this theory faced serious problems. No chemical residue was ever detected. Doctors could not identify any specific agent. The smells described by victims varied. Some said sweet, others metallic, others simply strange. A real chemical attack would likely produce more consistent results, and it would be difficult to carry out repeatedly without leaving evidence. There was also the question of motive. Why Mattoon? Why these houses? Why stop suddenly? No answer satisfied all three. The second theory focused on industrial contamination rather than deliberate attack. Perhaps gases or fumes escaped from nearby facilities. Perhaps changes in weather conditions trapped them near the ground. Perhaps they drifted into homes through open windows. This explanation accounted for the lack of a suspect. It also explained why no device was ever found. But again, the details did not align perfectly. Industrial odors were not new to Mattoon. Residents were familiar with them. The symptoms reported went beyond irritation. Paralysis is not a common reaction to low-level industrial fumes, and the timing remained difficult to explain. Why only at night? Why only for a few weeks? Why did it stop without intervention? The third theory would eventually become the most widely accepted by officials: mass hysteria, or more precisely, mass psychogenic illness. The idea that fear and expectation could produce real physical symptoms across a population. This phenomenon had been documented before, in factories, in schools, in communities under stress. The conditions in Mattoon were ideal for such an outbreak. A nation at war, a town already anxious, a rumor that spread quickly. Once people began expecting an attack, their bodies might respond to normal sensations as threats. A smell, a headache, a moment of dizziness, all interpreted through a lens of fear. This theory explains several aspects of the case: the lack of evidence, the variation in symptoms, the rapid spread, and the sudden disappearance once the narrative changed. But it also raised uncomfortable implications. It suggested that the victims were not attacked by an external force, but by their own nervous systems. This interpretation was deeply unpopular with those who had suffered. They insisted their experiences were not imagined. They had felt something. They had smelled something. Their bodies had reacted. Psychogenic illness does not mean symptoms are fake. It means they are real, but their origin is psychological rather than physical. That distinction is difficult to accept, especially when the experience feels invasive. Another possibility exists between these explanations: a hybrid. Perhaps a small number of incidents had a physical cause, an odor, a chemical irritant, something environmental. And once the story spread, fear amplified subsequent experiences. In this version, the first few reports were real. The rest were shaped by expectation. This theory accounts for both the initial trigger and the later spread. It also explains why the incidents eventually stopped. Once the environment changed and authorities reframed the narrative, fear lost its momentum. Still, even this explanation cannot be proven. The historical record is incomplete. Many details were never documented. Some reports were exaggerated. Others were dismissed too quickly. Time eroded what little evidence might have existed. What remains is a pattern without a clear cause, and that is what makes the Mad Gasser of Mattoon so enduring. It cannot be solved by a single explanation. It resists closure. Each theory answers some questions and creates others. If it was hysteria, why did it manifest so consistently? If it was chemical, why was no trace found? If it was both, where does one end and the other begin? Historians who study the case often emphasize its context. Mattoon was not unique. Similar episodes have occurred throughout history. Periods of stress, uncertainty, fear, invisible threats. In such conditions, communities can experience events that feel external but originate internally. But even knowing this does not make the experience any less real. For the people who lived through it, the fear was genuine. The paralysis was real. The nights were long. The uncertainty was exhausting. And the lack of answers left a mark. Years later, some residents refused to talk about it. Others spoke openly. But almost all agreed on one thing: something happened. Even if no one could agree on what. The Mad Gasser of Mattoon occupies a space where science, psychology, and folklore intersect. It challenges the idea that every mystery has a solution. It reminds us that explanations depend on perspective, and that perspective is shaped by fear, memory, and context. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is not that there was an attacker, or that there wasn't, but that the truth may exist in a form that does not fit neatly into any category. Not a crime, not an illness, not a delusion, but a moment when a community experienced the limits of understanding. And in those limits, fear found room to grow. When the nights in Mattoon finally returned to silence, there was no announcement, no press conference, no declaration that the danger had passed. The reports simply stopped. One evening came and went, then another. Windows were opened again. Lights were turned off. Families began sleeping through the night. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. But something fundamental had changed. The town had learned that not all threats announce themselves. Some arrive quietly, without sound, without shape, without explanation. And once that lesson is learned, it cannot be unlearned. In the years that followed, the Mad Gasser of Mattoon became a story told cautiously, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a curiosity, sometimes as a joke, but always with an undertone of discomfort, because no one could say with certainty what had happened. There was no ending to point to, no resolution to lean on, only interpretations, and interpretations change depending on who is listening. For some, the official explanation was enough. They accepted that fear, stress, and suggestion had combined to produce a temporary outbreak of symptoms. They moved on. For others, that explanation never fully settled. They remembered the smell. They remembered the paralysis. They remembered the certainty that something had entered their homes. And no theory could fully erase that memory. The Mad Gasser did not become a legend because of violence. No one was killed. No property was destroyed. It became a legend because it revealed how fragile certainty can be, how easily normal life can be disrupted by something that leaves no trace. It showed that fear does not need evidence to be powerful. It needs only possibility. Possibility is enough to keep people awake at night. Possibility is enough to change behavior. Possibility is enough to turn silence into a threat. From a historical perspective, Mattoon represents a moment when multiple forces converged. A nation at war, a town under stress, rumors moving faster than facts, institutions struggling to maintain calm, and individuals trying to make sense of sensations they could not control. No single factor explains everything, and that may be the most honest conclusion. Human experience does not always fit clean categories. Sometimes events exist between explanations. They borrow elements from psychology, environment, and social dynamics. They resist simple labels, and when they do, they linger. The Mad Gasser of Mattoon lingers because it asks uncomfortable questions, not about attackers, but about perception, about how people interpret the unknown, about how fear spreads, about how communities respond when certainty disappears. It challenges the idea that if something cannot be proven, it did not happen. And it challenges the idea that explanation always brings comfort. For the people who lived through it, the experience was real. Their fear was real. Their symptoms were real. And those realities matter, regardless of cause. Today, Mattoon is just another American town. Quiet, ordinary. Visitors pass through without knowing its history. But for a brief period in 1944, it became the center of something deeply unsettling. A reminder that mystery does not always arrive with drama. Sometimes it arrives with a smell in the dark and leaves without a trace. The Mad Gasser of Mattoon remains unsolved, not because investigators failed, but because the truth may not exist in a single form. It may exist in fragments, in memory, in fear, in context, and in the spaces between what people experienced and what can be proven. That is why the story endures. Not because it offers answers, but because it refuses to. And in that refusal, it reflects something deeply human, our need to understand, and our discomfort when understanding remains just out of reach.